Hello there and welcome back. Let's talk about the best starter specs for WoW in 11.1. WoW is a big game and can be a daunting challenge for a lot of the time playing it, especially for new players, but even people who haven't played in a long time and are now coming back into the game. You can play anything really, but what if you wanted the most fun classes that are also meta viable? Push the highest key you can in Mythic Plus with the strongest and most forgiving specs for beginners. What should you main in patch 11.1 if you want smooth gameplay? I think at this point and in the foreseeable future, the easiest spec to play in modern WoW is definitely Retribution Paladin. As a melee DPS, it has the fewest generic weaknesses a melee DPS spec has, giving it an easier time to be picked up by new players. Divine Steed is an amazing ability to use when you quickly decide you are in the wrong spot or have to get to a new spot just as quick. Blessing of Freedom, on the other hand, removes effects that slow or root your character, which can also be applied to other people. On top of this, you have a lot of range on your abilities, letting you hit your target even when you are far away from it, something most melee DPS will not be able to do. And this is something that we can talk about further. Having a good utility kit is not necessarily something new players would need to engage with, but having access to immunities is. Immunities for a new player can act as a form of "oh shit" button, where something unexpected happens in the game, a boss puts a fire puddle under you, or you accidentally pull a pack of mobs in a dungeon that wasn't supposed to be pulled. Popping Divine Shield or Blessing of Protection will make surviving a much easier task, and of course, mastering these spells can help you deliberately become immune to damage so that you can do specific things that you couldn't otherwise, like you're stuck in a corner because of the bad stuff on the ground and you have to walk through the zones that would kill you otherwise to get to your party or your target, and so much more. And of course, there are a bunch of other panic buttons that can help you overcome things you weren't aware of. What's more important is that playing Paladin is rotationally very easy and straightforward. You build this holy power thing with weak abilities and then spend it on strong abilities for a lot of damage. Once your Wake of Ashes or Avenging Wrath are available, you just press them and keep doing what you were doing before. The simplicity of Retribution is one of the two things that make it currently the most popular spec in the game and has been the case for the last 2 years. The other thing would be its damage. Retribution does a lot of damage, but not the most. Even so, the strong point here is that doing this damage is incredibly easy, to the point where other players criticize it in bad faith for not requiring the same amount of work as their own class, which is ironically why this is such a good spec for a lot of people, especially those who want to learn the more intricate aspects of the end game. If your goal is to either raid, push Mythic Plus keys as high as possible, or both, the spec to start doing this with will be Beast Mastery Hunter. This spec was the former king of easiest DPS, which it lost to Red Paladin at the moment, but that didn't necessarily make Beast Mastery complicated. It's still a very easy spec to pick up and play. If anything, it's probably the second easiest spec in the game after Retribution. The advantage it has over Red in End Game PVE is that it is a range damage dealer, but also can do its rotation while moving. Although Red has mobility and range on some of its abilities, you cannot compete with a spec that never has to stand still to deal damage. Ranged DPS in video games have an incredible advantage over everyone else in the fact that they can be far away from danger. This gives them more time to react and make a decision, but can also see more of the combat. Melee DPS tends to be too close to the elephant to see the whole thing a lot of the time. Beast Mastery was how I became a proper raider as well, and this is a fun little story. Up until Battle for Azeroth, I raided on and off, and that was mostly by casually pugging or being by accident in a guild or two. This all changed when Marcelian and I decided to do class guides and realized we needed some actual raiding experience, first to know what we are talking about, but also to get different classes into a raiding environment. This was in Battle for the Zara lore, the second raid of the expansion. I was an elemental shaman at the time and didn't know my left from my right. It didn't help that it was probably the hardest DPS to play at the time. I quickly realized I was overwhelmed. it was the first time I was in a decent guild with a decent raiding schedule that was clearing heroic bosses, and maybe a mythic boss or two. I steadily got better over time, but eventually hit a point where I didn't know what to do to get better and figured this couldn't be as high as I could go. Surely there was more I could do to improve and be a better player. The next raid tier, I made a call to start over from scratch and learn what raiding means, learn how to do the mechanics and not fail at them, learn to be able to look around and see what was happening to the raid. And the best spec for this was clearly Beast Mastery Hunter, since it was the easiest at the time, way easier than now by the way, which allowed my brain some space to process me having to move around and drop bottles, CC ads, and do all sorts of things while also keeping up my damage. Because I died.
Yeah, boy!
Yeah, boy, what's up?
Finally, god damn it.
On top of it being the best spec to learn endgame content with, it comes with a bloodlust ability that people will definitely want, and pets that can tank for you. This last part isn't super important, but if you can manage your pet, specifically in dungeons, you can have it tank, have it take aggro or threat away from you so you can survive, and much more. If you're doing solo content, whether it is old raids, questing, rare farming, mount collecting and more, by far the best spec to play is Havoc Demon Hunter, and hear me out. Some people swear by Beast Mastery since you have pets that can handle the tanking for you, range damage and tools to peel off enemies off of you so you can just disengage from combat, which are all true, but Havoc just brings a couple of key things that nobody else does. First of all is gliding. When you are doing solo content, you can find yourself being knocked into the air by certain bosses or farming a rare up a mountain or near a cliff and end up falling down. Being able to glide obviously eliminates that threat of dying to fall damage, which in open world is present. Not very often, but when it happens, it can add a lot of time to what you are doing. Gliding makes skipping parts of content you don't need possible as well, which adds to the speed of what you are doing. Not to mention that Havocs are actually fast, maybe the fastest spec in the game. Gliding can make you actually avoid dying by deliberately jumping down a cliff, mountainside or bridge to evade combat. You would be gliding down when the enemies would try to find the route down to you that eventually leads them back into being reset. The second major thing is that you have a lot of self-sustain. This is something that other classes have as well, most of the time through their own healing abilities, which makes Leech so much more valuable. With Leech, you can stay in combat and do your damage without having to stop, waste time and mana on healing yourself while your casts are pushed back from taking damage. Havoc also has good defensives and also an immune in Netherwalk. Unlike Retribution, you cannot attack during it, same as Beast Mastery, but again, unlike Retribution, you gain a massive amount of burst speed that can help you get out of trouble. Havoc is probably the fastest spec in the game at clearing content, whether it is farming reputation, mounts, rares, transmogs, or anything else you can think of, and the fact that you can rely on yourself alone to do it all makes it the premier solo spec. Now, when it comes to being invited into groups, we are approaching spicy territory, especially since this is a very relative issue relative to class balance, what is perceived as meta, and what do people actually need, which it changes every time and the best spec would be different every patch. Which is why it's better to talk about a class that can perform in all situations. You might not have the absolute best DPS, tank or healer spec in the game, but the options available for you will give you access to anything you want to do. And that class is obviously Druid. Druid is the only class with 4 specializations ranging from all roles: tank, healer, melee DPS and range DPS. If you decide to be a Druid player and learn all of these specs, you will have an answer for anything and everything. Not to mention that if we are talking about more recent WoW, people are in dire need of healers and tanks, now more than ever. It's not easy to keep up 4 specs up to date with endgame content for what you would want to be invited to, but it can be worth it. Druid can also apply to the previous categories as well. It won't be better than what we recommended, but as an example, Guardian Druid and Balance are incredibly easy specs to play and get into. Feral is usually an above average raid damage dealer, while Balance would be that for Mythic Plus. Guardian Druid is great for solo content since you can fight an endless stream of mobs while never dying and healing yourself in the process, with Restoration being a healer with a lot of tools for a group. Mark of the Wild to buff your group with probably the best group buff in the game. Rebirth is a combat resurrect ability that can bring allies back to life during combat, some of the most amount of utility and crowd control any one healer can bring, not to mention that in any situation, Druid is the only class that can mount during combat. It won't be the full speed mount, but it would be faster than what most specs gain access to, faster than enemies can catch up to you, all while being able to remove an endless amount of effects that slow, root, or movement impair your character through the act of shape shifting. Druid is considered to be a jack of all trades but a master of none, which is what you are looking for if you want one answer to getting into groups in all situations at all times. Everything is subjective, of course, but there are easier and more productive ways to approach the world of modern Warcraft than diving right in. At the end of the day, you can play what you like, but what if you could play the best spec to start learning aspects of the game? Since no matter what you would choose, you can easily end up playing everything anyway. With the warband feature and how accessible stuff is, having alts is way easier than in the past. And if you want to know even more about getting into groups, check our video on how to improve getting invites in 11.1. Spoiler alert, we talk about essentially improving the chances of you getting invited to raids and dungeons by making sure you do a few key things, some of them obvious, some of them less obvious.